October 13th, 1944. The prison truck stopped outside Camp Alderbrook in northern Vermont, and 19 German women climbed down into an American pole they did not understand. Marta Renner stepped last. She was 24, a surgical aide from Dresden, still wearing the gray auxiliary coat that had crossed France with her in the back of a collapsing medical convoy. The coat smelled of disinfectant, rain, and the long fear of capture. She had prepared herself for American prison, hunger, interrogation, a barracks floor, maybe worse. What she had not prepared herself for was beef, not the word, the smell. It rolled across the compound from a low wooden building behind the wire, onions frying in fat, coffee boiling in a metal urn, barley thickening in broth, and something sweet baking somewhere behind it all. For one stunned second, every woman stopped walking. Ilse Brenner, a signal clerk from Hamburg with sharp cheekbones and a sharper tongue, leaned close to Marta and whispered in German, "Do not look hungry. That is what they want." Anja Ritter, the youngest of them, barely 18, clutched a canvas bag against her ribs. "I forgot food could smell like that." No one laughed. They all knew what she meant. Back home, meat had become a rumor. Butter had become memory. Bread had become a dark, sour brick stretched with anything that could make flour last one more week. Heed Scholl, a quartermaster clerk old enough to have watched ration sheets turn into lies, put one steady hand on Anja's shoulder. "Keep moving," she said. But even Heedy's voice shook because the smell was impossible, and impossible things inside a prison camp are rarely gifts. Captain Ruth Bell waited inside the processing room with a clipboard, a pressed uniform, and the tired eyes of a woman who had spent too many months turning frightened people into file numbers. Before the war, she had run a county library in Ohio. She still had the habit of looking at each person as if there were a story attached to the name. "You will be registered," she said. The interpreter repeated her German. "You will receive blankets, medical examination, and barracks assignment." A few women stared at the floor. Then Captain Bell added, "After that, supper." The interpreter hesitated on the word. Then he said it. "Abendessen, supper." The room changed, not loudly. No one gasped. No one asked a question. But 19 women who had been trained to expect cruelty suddenly had to decide whether the promise of food was a kindness or another kind of weapon. 2 hours later, they were marched across the compound toward the mess hall. The smell was stronger now. It had weight. It came through the windows in waves of steam and browned onion. Marta saw American soldiers moving with trays in their hands. She saw tin cups. She saw white bread stacked in clean slices. She saw a tray of cornbread cut into squares, so yellow it almost hurt to look at. Then she saw the pot, a kettle large enough to wash sheets in, filled with beef and barley stew, actual beef. Not a bone passed through hot water, not cabbage pretending to be supper. Beef. Staff Sergeant Earl Whitcomb stood behind the serving line with a ladle in his hand and flour on one sleeve. He was a broad Iowa man with farmer's shoulders and a cook's patience, the kind of patience that comes from knowing heat, cannot be bullied into doing its work faster. Beside him stood Private Miguel Alvarez, 19 years old, from a family bakery in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He had been drafted into a country that still did not always know what to call men like him, but he understood kitchens. He understood hunger. He understood that food could say what language could not. Earl looked at the women and softened his voice. "Take a tray," he said. They did not understand him. So he lifted one tray from the stack and placed it gently into Heed Scholl's hands. That was enough. Heed moved first. She walked down the line as if she were crossing a bridge that might vanish beneath her. Earl filled her plate with stew till the gravy reached the rim. Miguel added potatoes, green beans, 2 squares of cornbread, and a pat of butter wrapped in wax paper. Butter. Aide stared at it. Her hand tightened around the tray. Marta watched the older woman's face do something dangerous. It almost broke. Then Aide carried the tray away without a word. One by one, the others followed. When Marta reached the serving line, she held out her tray with both hands. She did not want Earl to see them trembling. He ladled stew onto the plate, then paused, studied her hollow cheeks, and added another spoonful. This batch needed a little more pepper, he said, knowing she could not understand. So blame me if it bites. Miguel placed cornbread beside the stew and pointed toward a small crock. Honey butter, he said. Marta did not know those words either, but she knew the color of honey. She carried the tray to the nearest table and sat down across from Ilse, who had gone very pale. The mess hall should have been noisy. It was not. 19 German women sat before American food in a silence, so careful it sounded almost religious. Forks scraped metal. Steam lifted from plates. Somewhere in the back of the room a soldier laughed, then stopped when he saw their faces. Marta took the first bite. The stew was too hot. It burned her tongue. She almost cried anyway. Not because it was perfect, because it was ordinary. Pepper, salt, onion, fat, bread made from real flour. Coffee strong enough to leave bitterness at the back of the throat. Ordinary food given to enemy prisoners as if ordinary decency still existed. Anja bent over her tray with tears falling straight into the stew. Ilse ate with mechanical discipline, each bite small, controlled, angry. Across the table, Keitha Voss, a former welfare supervisor from Cologne, and the most loyal among them to every slogan they had been taught, pushed her food around with theatrical disgust. They feed us because they want something, she muttered. No enemy gives comfort for free. He looked down at her plate, then at the cornbread, then at the American cook moving from table to table with a coffee pot. Maybe, he'd said quietly, we were told the wrong story. No one answered, because that sentence was more dangerous than the wire. 3 weeks later, the camp kitchen nearly failed. An influenza outbreak swept through the American staff, taking half the cooks and most of the dish crew off their feet by dawn. Sergeant Whitcomb stood in the kitchen at Bonzabonmi in the morning, looking at sacks of potatoes, trays of bread dough, 20 pounds of onions, and a breakfast schedule that did not care who had a fever. By Numzo Mui Lum, he was in Captain Bell's office, making a request that would have sounded absurd in any other war. Mom, he said, I need workers. The German women can cook. Captain Bell removed her glasses. They are prisoners. Yes, Mom. They are enemy personnel. Yes, Mom. Earl did not look away. But they are also hungry women with hands, he said. And I have a kitchen full of food that won't prepare itself. At Sauzo, Heed Scholl stood in an American mess kitchen with an apron tied over her prison coat and a knife in her hand. Marta stood beside her. So did Anja, 2 nurses, and, after a long argument with herself, Ilse Brenner. Keith refused. She remained in the barracks and called the volunteers servants. But in the kitchen, the insult did not reach very far. There was too much work. Earl showed them how to cut potatoes for hash. Miguel showed Anja how to roll biscuits without crushing the dough flat. Marta learned that American cooks measured coffee like ammunition. Earl learned that German women could turn yesterday's potatoes into pancakes with nothing but onions, salt, and memory. Words came slowly: flour, Mel, salt, Salz, knife, Messer, hot, heiss, careful, vorsichtig. At first, they spoke with gestures and pointed fingers, then with broken nouns, then with sentences that sounded like they had been assembled from spare parts. Ilse resisted the longest. She chopped carrots beside Miguel with the stiff posture of a soldier refusing surrender. But Miguel had grown up in a bakery where silence was considered bad for dough. He hummed while he worked, old border songs, hymns. radio tunes, anything that filled the air without demanding an answer. On the fourth morning, he badly mispronounced the German word for onion. Ilse corrected him before she could stop herself. He tried again. Worse. Her mouth twitched. Miguel grinned. And for the first time since her capture, Ilse Brenner laughed. It was not a large laugh. It did not forgive the war. It did not erase what had happened or what was still happening. But it landed in the kitchen like a match struck in a dark room. After that, the work changed. Not into friendship. Not yet. Into rhythm. The women peeled, chopped, stirred, carried, scrubbed, and baked. Their hands found the old knowledge their bodies had not forgotten. They were prisoners, but they were no longer only being kept. They were useful, and usefulness did something captivity could not. It gave the day a spine. By late November, the mess hall had begun to look different during meals. Not officially. No order changed. No one announced a new policy, but soldiers lingered at tables where German women sat. Prisoners nodded to cooks. Anja traded the English word for cinnamon for the German word Zimt. Aide corrected Earl's attempt at potato dumplings with the merciless honesty of a woman who respected food too much to flatter him. And Marta began to understand the strange new law of the place. The gate said enemy. The table said human. Every day, both were true. December came hard to Vermont. Snow banked against the barracks walls and turned the camp lights into pale yellow coins floating in the dark. News from Europe arrived in fragments. Cities bombed, fronts collapsing, names of towns spoken on American radios, as if each one did not contain someone's mother. On December 24th, Anja woke before dawn and began crying into her blanket. Marta heard her from the next cot. At first she pretended not to, because grief deserved privacy. Then Anja whispered, "My mother always made raisin bread on Christmas Eve, that was all. Not I miss her, not I am afraid. Just raisin bread." And somehow that was worse. By mid-morning, Captain Bell had approved another kitchen exception. No ceremony was announced. No speech was made. But Sergeant Whitcomb opened the pantry shelves wider than usual, and Miguel produced a small paper sack of raisins he claimed had been miscounted, though everyone knew better. Aide took command immediately. German Christmas bread, she explained, could not be rushed by American optimism. Earl surrendered the work table to her. Marta kneaded dough until her wrists ached. Anja brushed melted butter across the tops, with the concentration of a child painting a sacred icon. Ilse stood over a pot of red cabbage, pretending not to care whether it came out correctly. The kitchen filled with impossible smells: cinnamon, yeast, roasting beef, coffee, brown sugar, cabbage simmering with vinegar and cloves. American soldiers drifted past the kitchen door and slowed down, as if the air itself had caught them by the sleeve. A corporal from Wisconsin, whose grandmother had spoken German in the house until the day she died, stopped near Anja. He cleared his throat. "Fröhliche Weihnachten," he said carefully. Anja froze. Then she smiled through tears and whispered back, "Merry Christmas." That evening the mess hall was rearranged. Not like a prison, like a long farm supper. Pine branches lined the window ledges. Paper stars hung from twine. The tables held American stew, German raisin bread, boiled potatoes, red cabbage, cornbread, coffee, and an apple dessert. Earl called pan dowdy because, he said, the name was ugly, but the dish was honest. Captain Bell stood at the head of the room. She had intended to say something formal. Instead, she looked at 19 German women, 30 American soldiers, a Mexican-American private dusted with flour, and an Iowa mess sergeant pretending his eyes were not wet. "We are all far from home tonight," she said. The interpreter translated. No one needed him to. For a little while, the war outside the room did not vanish. It waited, but it had to wait outside. January 19th, 1945. brought the letters. Captain Bell entered the barracks with a Red Cross mail pouch and an expression Marta would remember for the rest of her life. There were 11 letters for 19 women. That meant 8 women received only the sound of other people opening envelopes. Marta's letter came from her younger brother, Lucas. It had been written in November in a hand that tried to look calm and failed. He did not say Dresden was starving. He wrote, "We are learning to be economical." He did not say their mother was ill. He wrote, "Mother spends more time resting now." He did not say the apartment was gone. He wrote, "The new room is smaller, but the cellar walls are strong." Marta read the letter once, then again, then a third time until the careful sentences began to show their bones. Across the barracks, Ilse opened a letter from her fiancé on the Eastern Front. He wrote that the men dreamed about soup so loudly in their sleep that they woke one another. He wrote that boots mattered more than bullets, because frostbite took feet before the Russians did. He wrote one line at the end that made Ilse press the paper against her mouth. "If you are warm anywhere, stay warm for me." Aide received nothing. Anja received nothing. Kathy received a letter from a cousin in Cologne telling her that 2 nephews were dead, that the city looked like a broken stove, and that people were trading wedding rings for potatoes. That afternoon, the mess hall served roast pork, boiled carrots, and bread pudding. Marta could not eat. She stared at the plate until the pork fat cooled white along the edge. Sergeant Whitcomb noticed from the serving line. He came to the table with the cautious walk of a man approaching a wounded animal. "You sick?" he asked softly. Marta looked at him, this decent man, this enemy. This cook, who had fed her better than her own family, had eaten in years. Suddenly his kindness felt unbearable. "My brother writes from a cellar," she said in broken English. "My mother rests because she is weak, not because she is old. My city has no food." Her voice rose. "I am prisoner, and I have meat. They are free, and they have nothing." The mess hall quieted near them. Marta hated that she was crying. She hated that she wanted him to understand. She hated that part of her blamed him for a war neither of them had begun, and both of them were trapped inside. Earl sat down across from her without asking permission. For a moment he said nothing. Then he folded his hands on the table. "I can't feed your mother," he said. The interpreter was not there, but Marta understood enough. Earl spoke slowly. "I can't stop what bombers do. I can't bring your city back. I can't pretend this camp fixes the world." He pointed, not at her plate, but at the kitchen. "But I can decide that hunger will not be my weapon. Not in my kitchen." Marta looked down. The plate blurred. Something inside her shifted then. Not into gratitude, not exactly. Into a terrible understanding. The Americans feeding her did not cancel German suffering. German suffering did not erase American mercy. Both truths could sit on the same table, and that was why the table hurt. That night, Voss stood in the barracks aisle with her Red Cross letter clutched in one fist and declared what many had been too ashamed to say. "We are being softened," she said. "Can none of you see it? They feed us. They make us laugh. They give us work and coffee and Christmas bread. And while we grow comfortable, Germany burns." No one moved. Keitha pointed toward the mess hall. "We have become pets." Anja flinched. Ilse looked down. Marta waited for Aide to answer, but the older woman remained silent. So Marta stood. Her legs were unsteady. Maybe from anger. Maybe from the letter folded under her pillow. "No," she said. The word surprised even her. Keitha turned. Marta searched for English, failed, and continued in German. "A pet is fed so it forgets it has a soul. That is not what happened here." Her voice caught, then steadied. "We were told our enemies were beasts. They were told we were monsters. In that kitchen, every day, someone has to decide whether to believe that. Earl decides with a ladle. Miguel decides with bread. Captain Bell decides with blankets and letters and work. She looked around the barracks. And we decide too. Keitha's face hardened. Then you admit it. You are grateful. Marta swallowed. Yes, she said. The barracks went still. I am grateful, and I am ashamed, and I am afraid for my family, and I am angry. All of it. The war made us think only one thing could be true at a time. She looked toward the dark window, where the mess hall lights glowed beyond the snow. But a table is wider than that. No one applauded. No one applauded. No one embraced her. This was not that kind of moment. But the next morning, Ilse came to kitchen duty early. So did Anja. So did two women who had refused for weeks. Keitha did not come. Not then. But 3 days later, Marta found her at the dish sink, sleeves rolled, washing pots with furious precision. No one mentioned it. That was mercy, too. By April, the war was collapsing faster than the camp could understand it. Maps in the administration office changed every morning. City names moved from rumor to fact. Vienna, Königsberg, Nuremberg, Berlin. American soldiers spoke more quietly now, not because they were less certain of victory, but because victory had begun to look less like a parade and more like the opening of a grave. On April 28th, Captain Bell received orders to prepare the women for repatriation processing. The announcement came after breakfast. 19 women stood in 2 lines while the interpreter explained that Germany's surrender was expected soon. When hostilities ended, their status would change. Paperwork would begin. Transport would follow. Home. That was the word everyone had waited for. Home. And yet no one cheered, because by then, home had become a question with smoke in it. That evening, Sergeant Whitcomb asked permission to cook one final shared supper before the process began. Captain Bell approved it before he finished the sentence. The kitchen filled before dawn. This time, no one had to ask for volunteers. Aide made potato dumplings from memory. Ilse prepared red cabbage and corrected Miguel's slicing until he threatened cheerfully to promote her above him. Anja rolled dough for raisin bread, with tears dropping onto her apron. Marta stirred a pot of beef and barley stew, the same dish that had met them on their first night. Though now the smell no longer felt like a trick. It felt like a record. Every onion browned in fat carried a month. Every loaf carried a name. Every plate carried a question no officer could file neatly. When the meal was ready, the mess hall looked almost beautiful. White cloths had been pulled from storage. Wild branches stood in coffee tins on each table. Someone had found candles, though Captain Bell made them keep the flames low and away from the paper stars. American soldiers and German prisoners sat together because nobody could remember the exact point at which that had become normal. Earl stood with a cup of coffee in his hands. He had written something on paper, then folded it away. First night you came in, he said. You all looked at that stew like I'd set a trap. A small sound moved through the room. Not laughter, recognition. I guess maybe I did, he continued, just not the kind you feared. He looked at the women. My grandmother used to say, a man who feeds hate will never run out of it. So you feed something else whenever you can. His voice thickened. I don't know what waits for you over there. I wish I did. But I know this. You worked in my kitchen. You fed my men. You taught us words we didn't know and recipes we didn't deserve. You were prisoners here, but you were never scraps. Marta translated. This time, her voice broke before the last sentence. After supper, while dishes soaked and the candles burned low, Marta asked Captain Bell if she could speak. Bell nodded. Marta stood in the room that had undone so many certainties. She spoke in English because she wanted the Americans to hear her directly, even if the grammar came wounded. Some of us have no house to return, she said. Some have no family left. Some have family, but no place to stand. She looked at Aide, then Ilse, then Anja. We know we cannot stay as prisoners. We know war has laws, but if there is a way after, a legal way, with work, with sponsors, with any paper that lets us ask. Some of us want to ask. The room went silent. Even the dishwater seemed to stop moving. Captain Bell's face did not change, but her eyes did. You are asking to remain in America? Marta nodded. Not because Germany is not ours, she said. Because the Germany we served is dying. And maybe the only honest thing left is to become people who do not serve it anymore. Ilse stood next. A month earlier, she would have called the request betrayal. Now she held her hands together, like someone praying without admitting it. I thought kindness was poison, she said. I thought if I accepted it, I would lose myself. But maybe I was already lost before I came here. Aide rose with the slow authority of age. I have no husband waiting, she said. My sister writes that our street is gone. I am useful in a kitchen. I am useful in a bakery. I am useful somewhere. Let me be useful in a country that has seen me as an enemy and still let me make bread. Anja could barely speak. I am 18, she said. I do not want the rest of my life to be only the uniform I wore when I was afraid. Captain Bell looked at them for a long time. She was a soldier. She could not simply open the gate. There were laws, boards, sponsors, investigations. Angry letters from people who would never understand why German prisoners deserved anything but removal. But she was also Ruth Bell, who had once believed a library was a place where strangers could sit under the same roof and leave less strange than before. I cannot promise an outcome, she said. The interpreter translated. I can promise the request will not disappear in my desk. That was all. And for that night, it was enough. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. By summer, the women of Camp Alderbrook were scattered by policy, paperwork, and fate. 11 were sent back to Europe. 3 found relatives in Canada through church sponsors. 5, after months of hearings and affidavits and suspicion, remained in the United States under civilian sponsorship. Not easily, not cleanly. No door simply opened because a story deserved one. Marta spent 2 years working in a hospital laundry before she was allowed to train again as a nurse. Ilse became a translator for shipping firms near Boston, where she learned that radios sounded different when nobody was using them to direct planes through war. He'd worked in a German bakery in Milwaukee and made potato dumplings every Thursday until customers began arranging their week around them. Anja finished school at night, then taught children whose parents still called her accent enemy when they thought she could not hear. Kathy went home. She wrote once, in 1951, from a town outside Cologne. The letter was short. It said only, I still think we were broken. I no longer know whether that was a bad thing. 21 years after the first stew, on October 13, 1965, Marta Renner stood in the basement kitchen of a Lutheran church in Milwaukee, stirring beef and barley in a pot that was nowhere near large enough to hold the past. The room smelled of onions, coffee, warm bread, and raincoats drying near radiators. Ilse arrived from Boston with a gray streak in her hair and a suitcase full of letters she had translated for immigrant families who were still learning how to belong somewhere. Anja came from Cleveland with 3 children and a laugh that no longer asked permission. Aide came upstairs from the bakery she now owned, carrying raisin bread so rich with butter that Earl Whitcomb would have called it a scandal. And Earl came, older now, slower in the knees, his Iowa shoulders rounded by time, but his hands still restless around any kitchen. Miguel Alvarez came too, in a brown suit his wife had pressed twice, carrying a box of pastries from the New Mexico bakery his brothers had rebuilt after the war. They did not gather as heroes. There were no reporters, no plaque, no official history of the night 19 enemy women learned that an American prison camp could smell like supper. Their children heard the story in pieces, the truck, the wire, the tray too heavy for one frightened woman to trust, the first bite of stew, the Christmas bread, the letters, the argument in the barracks, the night they asked to stay in the country that had captured them. Marta's daughter, Elise, listened from the doorway. She was 16, born in America, impatient with old grief, and old enough to understand that every family has a room it does not enter until invited. Were you not afraid? She asked. Marta looked at the pot. Yes, she said. Of the Americans. Marta smiled faintly, at first. Then of what? The room quieted. Marta thought about the gate at Camp Alderbrook, the barbed wire silver with frost, the smell of stew moving through cold air like an insult, then a mercy, then a question. She thought about her mother, who had survived Dresden and once wrote, "Do not apologize for living where you found life." She thought about Kate the washing pots in silence. She thought about Earl, saying hunger would not be his weapon. At the end, Marta said, I was afraid that if I admitted my enemy was human, I would have to admit how much of my life had been built on lies. No one spoke. Then Earl, who had never learned to leave a table empty for long, began setting out bowls. Stew first, then bread, then butter, then coffee. The same order as the first night, though nobody had planned it. Or maybe they all had. As they ate, Marta watched her daughter taste the stew and reach for bread, without fear, without calculation, without any idea that there had been a time when a square of cornbread could crack open an entire country's story. That was the victory no general had announced. Not that the war ended. Wars end on paper. The deeper victory was that something survived the war without asking permission. A habit, a recipe, a decision made again and again by people who had every reason to withhold mercy and did not. The gate had made them prisoners. The table had made them human again.